In the quiet suburbs of Chicago in the late 1970s, a woman named Laurel Dillman walked into the office of psychotherapist Linda Tarazi. She wasn't looking for fame, nor was she particularly interested in the occult. She came seeking understanding, healing, a deeper sense of self. What neither of them could have predicted was that this journey into the psyche would unearth one of the most compelling past life cases ever documented. A story that would defy logic, stretch the boundaries of historical verification, and raise questions no skeptic could easily dismiss. Under hypnosis, Laurel began to speak in a voice not quite her own. Her accent shifted. Her vocabulary aged. What emerged was the identity of a woman named Antonia Micaela Maria Ruiz de Prado, born in 1555, not in modern America, but in the heart of the Spanish Empire, on the island of Hispaniola, a place of colonial conquest, conflict, and deep cultural entanglement between Spain, Africa, and the remnants of the native Taino people. Antonia's father, she claimed, was a Spanish military officer stationed in the New World. Her mother, a German woman of Protestant roots, had arrived there under mysterious circumstances. They were an unlikely couple, Catholic and Lutheran, soldier and scholar, and from that forbidden union, Antonia was born. But Antonia's early life was shadowed by tragedy. Her mother died when she was just a girl. Her memories describe the grief of a child who didn't understand death, only the cold silence it left behind. Orphaned in a strange land, Antonia was soon sent across the ocean to live with her uncle Karl, a former priest who had renounced the cloth and now taught philosophy in Germany. As she grew, Antonia's voice, still channeling through Laurel, became rich with details no modern person could easily invent. The layout of her uncle's house, the type of ink used in his manuscripts, the precise theological debates that consumed him. She spoke of an Oxford exile that had shaped his thinking, referencing real professors and heretical works banned by the Catholic Church at the time. Under hypnosis, she even cited Latin verses and book titles that matched obscure entries in 16th century academic records. Tarazi, no stranger to suggestibility and the risks of confirmation bias, began documenting every session in painstaking detail. She would later travel to libraries, universities, and archives across the United States and Europe, eventually even reaching Cuenca, Spain, to verify the strange world that unfurled from Laurel's subconscious. The more she checked, the more she found. Antonia's story took another dramatic turn when she turned 16. With her uncle's health deteriorating, she boarded a ship to return to the Spanish territories, this time to the mainland. She arrived in Cuenca, a city perched between steep gorges and echoing cathedrals, a place dominated by the church and haunted by the ever-watchful eye of the Spanish Inquisition. It was in Cuenca, Antonia claimed, that her life began to unravel. She inherited an inn, a modest establishment left behind by her deceased father. But her intelligence and independence made her a curiosity, and soon a threat. She read too much, spoke too freely, and questioned too boldly. In a time when women were expected to be silent and pious, Antonia stood out like a candle in the dark. She was arrested. What followed was not a simple tale of imprisonment. According to the memories, she was interrogated by an inquisitor named Sebastián de Olmedo, a man torn between duty and desire. Instead of condemning her, he became her protector, and eventually, her lover. Their relationship, forbidden and dangerous, played out in the shadows of monastic walls and candlelit confessionals. She spoke of secret meetings in the archives, whispered conversations behind curtained windows, and letters passed through gloved hands. All of this, of course, could have been the product of imagination, a vivid mind seeking attention. But then came the details, layers upon layers of them. Antonia described the exact structure of the Inquisition's tribunal in Cuenca. She knew the names of local officials, dates of known heresy trials, and even referenced a period when the number of inquisitors in the city temporarily dropped from 3 to 2. A detail Tarazi later confirmed in a rare administrative record from the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid. Antonia mentioned a college in Cuenca that at the time, local historians denied had ever existed. But months later, Tarazi found mention of it in a forgotten 19th century Spanish volume buried deep in a university archive. These weren't just coincidences. These were discoveries. Facts Laurel Dillman had no way of knowing, from a time and culture she had never studied, in a language she barely spoke. And yet, there was more. Much more. As Antonia's memories deepened, so did the darkness of her fate. And as Tarazi chased the trail of her forgotten life, the lines between past and present began to blur, until even the most rational minds had to stop and wonder, what if this was real? The second wave of sessions with Laurel Dillman began in the summer of 1981, after a 3-year pause. Linda Tarazi had spent the intervening years chasing the ghost of Antonia across maps, scrolls, and crumbling manuscripts. She had grown from therapist to investigator, part healer, part historian, and when Laurel returned to her office, the memories resumed with terrifying clarity. Antonia was no longer a curious young woman managing an inn in Cuenca. She was now a prisoner in her own city, watched by clerics, whispered about by neighbors, feared and desired in equal measure. According to her recollections, Antonia was accused of possessing forbidden texts. She had inherited several volumes from her uncle Carl, books of philosophy, theology, and science that had been banned by the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Catholic Church's infamous list of forbidden literature. She recalled hiding these books under the floorboards of her room, and later burning some of them by candlelight in fear of discovery. She spoke of the precise titles: De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium by Copernicus, Theologia Deutsch, and Commentaries on Erasmus, works considered heretical at the time. In Trance, Laurel described the thickness of the leather bindings, the scent of mold and ink, the marginalia written in Latin and German. She recited passages she could never have read consciously. When Tarazi cross-checked these details, she found that not only were the books real, but the specific editions and annotations matched those known to have circulated among secret Protestant circles in Europe during the late 1500s. Antonia was summoned before the Inquisition's tribunal. The scene, as recalled under hypnosis, was harrowing. She described being led into a chamber of cold stone, where 3 inquisitors, clad in black robes, sat behind a wooden desk carved with cruciform motifs. She spoke of the creak of the door as it shut behind her, the choking scent of incense, and the Latin prayers mumbled before the questioning began. But what truly unsettled Tarazi was the emotional weight of the session. Laurel trembled. Her voice changed. She wept without understanding why. In one session, Antonia recounted being locked in a cell beneath the Convento de las Carmelitas Descalzas, a cloistered building known for its severe architecture and iron-bound silence. The cell, she said, was no more than 5 feet wide. She remembered tracing prayers on the damp wall with her fingers, composing letters in her mind to no one who would read them. And then, the narrative took a dramatic turn. The Inquisitor Sebastián de Olmedo, whom she once feared, began to visit her in private. He was, by all accounts, a devout and educated man, torn between his ecclesiastical duty and the quiet admiration he had developed for the young woman he had condemned. Antonia recalled their conversations, whispered behind the veil of candles, where he confessed his doubts about the church's cruelty, his guilt over her arrest, and eventually his feelings. What unfolded between them was a relationship forbidden by every rule of the era. Antonia, powerless yet defiant, became both prisoner and confidant. She claimed that Sebastian arranged for her transfer to a less guarded convent under the pretense of spiritual rehabilitation. There, they met under the guise of confession. In one trance session, Laurel described the sound of Sebastian's boots echoing in the stone hallway, the warmth of his hand brushing against hers, the stolen kiss shared beneath a fresco of Saint Teresa. The image she painted was intimate and detailed, too visceral to dismiss, too precise to be imagined on a whim. But their clandestine romance could not last. Whispers reached the ears of the church. Sebastian was reassigned to Toledo, and Antonia, now seen as spiritually corrupted beyond repair, was returned to Cuenca and re-imprisoned. This time, there would be no mercy. Tarazi cross-referenced ecclesiastical appointments and found records that confirmed the abrupt transfer of an inquisitor named Sebastián de Olmedo from Cuenca to Toledo around the exact time period Antonia had described. The names matched, the dates aligned. Even the unusual phrasing in the transfer, por razones personales no especificadas, suggested scandal, or at the very least urgency. In later sessions, Antonia's voice grew distant. She spoke of a spiritual darkness that crept into her soul. She no longer resisted the rituals forced upon her. She submitted, mechanically, to Mass, confession, and penance. But her faith had fractured. She began to see visions, symbols that Tarazi would later recognize as alchemical, mystical, even Kabbalistic. Antonia spoke of a dream where a raven landed on her windowsill, blood dripping from its beak, whispering words in a language she didn't understand. She saw herself burning, not from fire but from light, from judgment. And then, she disappeared. Not in reality, but in the sessions. Laurel would enter trance. She would speak in Antonia's voice, but the narrative would stop. The timeline would freeze. Antonia was no longer in Cuenca, no longer in prison. She was gone. What happened to her? Did she die in custody? Was she executed in secret? Was her body buried in an unmarked grave beneath a convent floor? There were no records, no death certificate, no formal sentence found in the ecclesiastical archives. Just silence. And yet, in one final session, long after Tarazi had begun to accept the story's tragic end, Antonia returned. She was older, tired, alone. She lived, she said, in a rural village outside Cuenca, taken in by a sympathetic nun after the fall of the inquisitor who once loved her. Her body was frail, her eyes dimmed, but she survived. She lived long enough to see the new century dawn. And then, as quietly as she had arrived, she faded into the mists of time. In the final months of her sessions with Laurel Dillman, Linda Tarazi found herself caught in a paradox. The more she verified, the more impossible the story seemed. Antonia had lived, loved, feared, and endured in the margins of official history. Her words had reached across 4 centuries, not through manuscripts, but through memory. And now, through the quiet voice of a woman in trance, she was asking to be remembered. In the final months of her sessions with Laurel Dillman, Linda Tarazi found herself caught in a paradox. The more she verified, the more impossible the story seemed. Antonia had lived, loved, feared, and endured in the margins of official history. Her words had reached across 4 centuries, not through manuscripts, but through memory. And now, through the quiet voice of a woman in trance, she was asking to be remembered. What began as therapy had become something far greater. Tarazi documented the case meticulously. Over 44 sessions, hundreds of pages of transcriptions, historical inquiries, private travels, and interviews with scholars. She didn't set out to prove reincarnation. She simply followed the thread wherever it led. And what it revealed was staggering. In a single session, Antonia described the architecture of a building in Cuenca. Its wooden beams, the stone patterns in the walls, a well hidden in the courtyard. Years later, Tarazi visited that very building, now a municipal office, and found that every detail matched, even the now sealed well. Antonia had named priests, midwives, soldiers, even a bookseller by the name of Tomás de Herrera, who appeared in a dusty municipal registry from 1582, long forgotten by historians. But perhaps the most haunting element of the case was not the detail. It was the emotion. Laurel, in her waking life, had no memory of the sessions. She was not theatrical nor mystical by nature. She did not profit from the experience. In fact, the process exhausted her. Each session left her shaken, disoriented, often tearful. At one point, she asked Tarazi to stop the work. "I can't carry her pain anymore," she said. "It's too heavy." For Tarazi, this became more than research. It became a burden of witnessing. She was watching a life unfold through fragments of a psyche that should not have had access to any of this. And she began to wonder, what is memory really? Is it just the storage of neurons and synapses? Or is it something more, something woven through time and soul? The case of Antonia attracted the attention of philosopher Stephen Broad, who reviewed the material with cautious respect. Though skeptical of hypnotic regression as a tool for uncovering real past lives, he admitted, "This case contains an overwhelming volume of obscure, verifiable historical details. Either this woman had access to a profound psychic database, or she lived it." Broad raised the possibility of super psi, a controversial theory suggesting that the subconscious mind can psychically access information beyond the conscious self, explaining some cases without invoking reincarnation. But even that explanation failed to account for the emotional realism of Antonia's memories. The shame, the longing, the visceral trauma of betrayal and confinement. There was one session, perhaps the most unsettling of all, where Antonia described watching her own reflection in a piece of polished metal. "My face is not mine anymore," she said. "It belongs to time. It belongs to no one." Laurel wept as she spoke those words, her hands clutching her chest as if to hold in the sorrow of centuries. Tarazi published her findings in journals and presented them at conferences, where reactions were divided. Some applauded the rigor of her work. Others dismissed it as confirmation bias wrapped in theatrics. Yet none could disprove the documented alignments. No one could explain how Laurel, with no knowledge of 16th century Spain, could speak as Antonia did, down to the political shifts of the Inquisition or the phrasing of royal edicts. But beyond the academic debates, one truth remained. Antonia had been remembered. And maybe that's what matters most. Because the case of Antonia does not ask us to believe blindly. It asks us to listen to the quiet voices beneath the surface of consciousness, to the memories that rise unbidden, to the echoes of past lives that may, just maybe, be whispering still. In the final recorded session, Antonia's voice softened. "I was not important," she said, "but I was alive. I was loved, and I loved in return. Please, remember that I loved." The tape ended. The room was silent. But in the minds of those who heard her story, something lingered. An ache, a question, a flicker of memory not their own. And perhaps, in that moment, a forgotten woman from the 16th century finally found what every soul longs for: to be known, to be understood, to not have lived in vain.